The last time my family gathered without me, I watched the photos appear online. Smiles stretched wide, champagne raised high, while my name was scrubbed from every caption, as if I had never existed. That was the night I understood I wasn't forgotten. I was erased. My name is Eugenia Blackwell. The morning had been still, the kind of quiet that settles over the river before the heat of the Charleston sun burns it away. Inside my mansion, the air carried the faint scent of coffee and old wood polished smooth by years of care. It was a silence I had come to treasure, the opposite of the noise and laughter I once longed to be part of. 10 years earlier, that longing had died the night of my 45th birthday, while Robert stood in the center of a glittering banquet hall, showered with toasts and applause. I wasn't so much as a footnote in their evening. I remember staring at the photos later, each smiling face a reminder of my absence, each caption written as though I had never belonged in the first place. That was the night I stopped waiting for an invitation that would never come. Since then, the house I restored brick by brick had become both refuge and fortress. Its walls carried my story in ways no family scrapbook ever would. That morning, as sunlight poured across the floorboards, the sharp buzz of the gate shattered the calm. I walked to the entry screen and froze. My parents stood there, older, but still carrying themselves with the same brittle pride. Robert was beside them, shoulders stiff, his jaw set too tightly. A decade of silence collapsed into a single image, 3 figures who had erased me now, waiting at my door. I opened the gate, and for a moment, no one spoke. Their eyes flicked across the foyer, widening at the carved beams, the sweeping staircase, the light that glowed against the river view. But beneath their awe was something sharper, something colder. They hadn't come to reconcile. They had come with an agenda, and the storm was only beginning. Growing up, the gap between us was always measured in gifts, glances, and praise. Robert would tear through wrapping paper to find gleaming bicycles or brand new baseball gear, while my box held second-hand books passed down from a neighbor. At family dinners, he was paraded like a trophy. Every grade, every victory on the field recited as though the whole room needed to applaud. I sat on the edge of the table, invisible, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for my name to surface, but it never did. I clung to my own quiet passion, sketching rooflines and window arches while the others clapped for Robert's touchdowns. When I announced I wanted to study architecture and bring life back into the forgotten houses scattered across Charleston, the silence at the table was colder than any winter night. My father muttered about wasted time. My mother pressed her lips tight, and Robert smirked, as if I had admitted to chasing ghosts. The sting of their dismissal burned sharpest one Christmas. The house glowed with lights, laughter spilling from every corner, when my uncle raised his glass and said loud enough for all to hear, "If it weren't for Robert, the Blackwells would have nothing to be proud of." The words sank into me like a scar carved in stone. I kept my face still, but inside, something cracked. Years later, when my mother lay in a hospital bed after heart surgery, I drove there with flowers trembling in my hands and an envelope of savings I had scraped together. I reached the ward, only to find Robert standing guard at the door. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply said, flat and final, "Mom doesn't want to see you." I sat in the hallway as the hours dragged on, the bouquet wilting petal by petal in my lap, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. That was the moment it became clear. I wasn't forgotten. I had been erased, but before I left, a soft hand touched my shoulder. My aunt, eyes darting nervously toward the room, slipped a thin envelope into my palm. Inside were letters in my grandmother's familiar script. She had written of dreams worth protecting, of pain that could be turned into stone and mortar, of resilience stitched into the bones of our bloodline. Those words became my secret inheritance, while my family stripped me of their name. Those pages lit a fire no silence could extinguish. They became the scaffolding for the life I would one day build. The hidden anchor that kept me standing when love was nowhere to be found. Starting over meant swallowing pride and living on scraps. At night, I served coffee in a downtown cafe, plastering on smiles for strangers. And by dawn, I traded the smell of roasted beans for the dust and clang of a construction site. My evenings belonged to a shaky desk lamp in a rented room, sketches spread out over cheap plywood, my pen scratching long after the city had gone to sleep. I carried every bruise of that life with me. My palms split open from hauling bricks, streaks of plaster knotted in my hair. Dinners made of instant noodles washed down with coffee gone cold. I told myself the hunger was fuel, that one day it would all be worth it. But my first restoration project collapsed in front of me. Literally. The roof I thought I could salvage caved in mid-renovation, wiping out nearly all my savings. Whispers spread through Charleston's small business circle fast, and soon enough, Robert heard. His message came sharp, mocking. If you can't keep a roof standing, how will you ever hold your own life together? The words cut, but the ruin of that project wasn't the end. When I was down to my last dollar, a small group stepped in, an engineer who respected my designs, a carpenter with weathered hands, a mason who believed in craft over profit. They offered more than labor, they offered belief. Together, we picked through the rubble and started again. That night, I realized I wasn't abandoned anymore. I had found a family that chose me. The second project told a different story. A crumbling hotel in the heart of Charleston, left to rot for decades, opened its doors again under the light of my designs. Local papers splashed it across their pages, praising the revival of history. My name, once dismissed at family tables, now threaded its way through conversations in city hall meetings and neighborhood gatherings. Still, I clung to simplicity. I drove the same dented pickup, wore jeans faded by years of paint and dust, and kept my boots scuffed as a reminder of where I began. Meanwhile, Robert was rising on a different ladder. He launched his sleek real estate firm, scoffing at me for wasting time polishing antiques. He was the darling of investors for a moment, strutting in new suits, boasting of glass towers and modern condos. But cracks appeared fast. His ambitious projects devoured loans, one deal falling into default after another. By the time my name was etched into Charleston's historic preservation circles, rumors began to ripple. Robert's empire was trembling. For the first time, the roles had flipped. I, the sister they once erased, was building a legacy brick by brick, and Robert, the golden son, was sliding into the shadows of debt and desperation. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of stillness I'd learned to treasure. Sunlight filtered off the river and into the quiet of my mansion, the kind of quiet that felt earned after years of noise I no longer belonged to. The calm cracked when the gate buzzer jolted through the air. I glanced at the security screen and froze. My parents, Robert, a handful of relatives. Faces I hadn't seen in a decade stood clustered at the gate, aged but recognizable, heavy with something I couldn't yet name. I pressed the release and watched them approach the house, their steps faltering as they took in the details they had once sworn I would never achieve. The walnut floors, the restored paintings hung with care, the glass walls spilling light from the Ashley. Their mouths shaped polite words, but the stiffness in their bodies betrayed them. My mother said how quickly the years had passed. My father murmured something about the importance of family gathering again. Each sentence dripped with a false warmth that filled the room with awkward weight. Finally, after an exchange of hollow smiles, my father exhaled as though the effort of pretending was too much. His voice came flat, brittle. Robert's ventures had collapsed. The debts were choking. In that instant, the truth surfaced as sharp as glass. They weren't here to reconnect. They were here because Robert needed saving. And somehow, they had decided I was the vault that could preserve the Blackwell name. I led them into the great room where the glass walls opened to the river's sweep. The brightness of the morning pressed against the silence. Every breath waited as though the air itself were judging us. My father settled into a chair, straightening his back as if he still held authority. Family must help family. he declared, his tone ironed flat, as though repeating it could make it true. My mother folded her hands tightly, eyes pleading, her words tumbling over themselves in fragile appeals. Robert said nothing, his jaw locked, his gaze darting like a man already cornered. I let the silence stretch, then cut through it. I reminded them of the birthday they celebrated without me, the hospital door where I was barred, the wedding where my name wasn't spoken. My voice didn't tremble. It carried the weight of years. In all that time, I asked, whoever called me? Whoever wondered if I was still standing? No one spoke. My father looked at the floor. My mother blinked rapidly, her knuckles white around each other. Robert's shoulders drew tight, as though the question itself was a trap. And then it hit me, not just their silence, but the shift underneath it. They had once named me useless, a shadow they could erase. Yet here they were, in my home, desperate and powerless, while I sat steady in the seat they once denied me. The balance had tipped, and I could feel it settling firmly in my favor. The silence had grown so thick it pressed against the glass walls, until it was broken by a voice that did not belong to my blood. Robert's new companion leaned forward, lips curling into a smile that never touched her eyes. "If you're rich now," she said, each word deliberate, "you owe it to us. That's what family means." For a heartbeat, I almost expected my father to rebuke her, or my mother to flinch. But no one moved. The weight of her words settled on me, and instead of fury, something unexpected rose. I laughed. The sound rang through the room, sharp and startling, ricocheting off the high ceilings until every face stiffened. Their discomfort deepened as I kept laughing. Not cruelly, but with a release I hadn't felt in years. When the echo faded, I reached for the tablet beside me. The screen lit the room as I laid it flat on the table. Year after year of revenue figures, multi-million-dollar contracts, projects completed without a single cent from them. I swiped again. Photographs of hospitals restored, children smiling in rebuilt wings, letters of gratitude from students who had once thought college impossible. I lifted my gaze. "My duty isn't to rescue the Blackwell name," I said evenly. "My duty is to those who respect effort, who understand gratitude." My father dropped his eyes. My mother's lashes fluttered, tears trembling but unspilled. Robert's face flushed red, his fists tightening on his knees. I rose slowly, voice steady as stone. "This mansion is my home, not your bailout fund." The air inside the room was heavy, the silence more punishing than any shouted word. The sunlight that streamed through the wide panes of glass stretched across the floorboards and caught on the untouched pastries and the half-empty coffee cups, their steam long since gone. They sat there, abandoned, like props left behind after a performance no one wanted to admit had ended. The sight made my chest tighten, not with regret, but with clarity. Everything about this morning had been an act, a performance of concern staged to disguise desperation. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against wood jolting them out of their stillness. My steps toward the front doors echoed in the cavernous foyer, deliberate and steady. As I walked, the light from the Ashley grew brighter, flooding the house with a brilliance that was almost blinding. When I reached the threshold and pulled the handle, the door swung wide, and a gust of river air swept in. The sunlight poured over them like a spotlight, every bowed head caught in its unforgiving glare. No one spoke until my mother's voice broke the silence. Her hands were clasped tightly, as though in prayer, her knuckles pale and trembling. "We're still family," she whispered, almost pleading, as if the words alone could mend what a decade of silence had destroyed. I turned toward her, the light behind me, stretching my shadow long across the polished floor. My voice was even, sharpened by years of swallowed hurt. "A family doesn't erase one of their own for a decade," I said, my eyes fixed on hers. A family doesn't lock a daughter out of hospital doors or pretend she doesn't exist at birthdays and weddings. A family doesn't return only when the bills come due. Her lips parted as though she might answer, but nothing came out. My father shifted in his seat, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ground as though studying the rug could shield him from truth. Robert's face was flushed, his fists knotted in his lap, his pride shackling him into silence. The relatives behind them stared at the floor, unwilling to meet my gaze. I stood there, watching them drown in the weight of what I had laid bare. My hand, steady now, pressed against the door. With a slow pull, I opened it wide to the morning, the light flooding in so intensely it seemed almost holy. Then I stepped aside. "Go," I said, the single word ringing through the foyer like a verdict. None of them moved at first. They hesitated, perhaps waiting for me to soften, perhaps hoping for one last chance to spin a plea I might accept. But when I held their eyes, my father's flickering, my mother's brimming with tears they refused to let fall, Robert's fixed in a glare that carried more shame than anger, they understood. I wasn't going to bend. One by one. They rose. My father stood first, slower than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders sagging under the collapse of authority he had once worn like armor. My mother followed, her steps halting, her eyes glassy, clinging to the purse pressed against her chest like it was a lifeline. Robert was the last, his stride stiff, his jaw set in humiliation. He brushed past without a word, his silence louder than any outburst could have been. They passed the table on their way out, the cold coffee and untouched pastries beside them. For a fleeting moment, my mother's hand reached out, as though she wanted to take one last sip, one last piece, something to fill the void of what was slipping away. But she stopped herself, lowered her hand, and kept walking. As they stepped onto the porch, the sunlight struck them fully, their figures silhouetted against the brilliance of the river. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, stripped of the grandeur they once cloaked themselves in. I stood at the door, the brass handle cool beneath my palm, and let my gaze rest on them one last time. For years, I had carried the image of myself shut out, left standing in the cold outside a hospital door, flowers withering in my lap. And now, here they were, waiting in the doorway of my home, cast out by the truth they had written with their own hands. I drew a long breath, then closed the door. The sound was sharp, decisive, echoing through the mansion like the final punctuation at the end of a chapter that had consumed too much of my life. The reverberation lingered, and with it came a stillness that felt like release. On the other side of that door, their footsteps receded down the drive, heavy with shame. Inside, I stood rooted not in anger, but in certainty. The Charleston sun streamed through the glass, lighting the house I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, day by day. The family I had once begged to see me was gone, and for the first time in a decade, I felt entirely free. That night, I slipped into a small diner off the main road, the kind of place where the tables were scarred with years of use, and the lights hummed faintly above us. Waiting for me was the circle that had carried me through storms, friends who once shared dollar noodles on dusty floors, who stayed up with me under half-built ceilings when dreams felt fragile. We gathered around a long wooden table, the surface crowded with plates of simple food, the air filled with the kind of laughter that rattled the windows more than passing traffic. There were no champagne flutes, no polished silver, no staged smiles, just the steady warmth of people who had chosen me long before success had my name. Someone lifted a glass, eyes meeting mine with an ease I'd never known at my parents' table. "We don't need your money," he said. "We need you with us." The words landed deeper than any toast I'd ever heard. I felt something unclench inside me, a lightness blooming where old wounds had lived. For the first time, I realized I hadn't been left without a family at all. I had one here, built not by blood, but by loyalty, laughter, and shared nights of work. Later, back in my study, I unrolled the blueprint spread across my desk. It wasn't for profit or prestige. It was a plan for a community arts center, a place where children could draw freely and working families could gather hope. Healing, I finally understood, wasn't about stitching up broken ties. It was about walking away from them and building where you truly belong.